Mate 40 here. I just have a feeling that the things that we say this evening, they will echo in eternity. But let's not get crazy, right? Let's not get out of alignment with reality. I mean, let's grieve, right? I'm all for grieving. So let's grieve and whatever. Let's grieve for the loss of the United States of America as we know it. Let's grieve and whatever for the loss of our freedoms. Let's grieve and whatever for the prospects of our children. Let's grieve and whatever for life and love as we know it. But let's not do anything crazy, all right? Let's not do anything that restricts our future freedom of movement, right? If you get into conflict with reality, reality is always going to win. So let's grieve, yeah, for what we've lost, and let's grieve that the left controls all our major institutions, all right? But let's not do anything crazy here, all right? Let's not say anything that negatively impacts our life. Let's not get into any trouble here. Let's just come from a cool, calm, quiet place. And part of coming from a cool, calm, quiet place comes from reading the opposition. And there was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times today. The one thing Donald Trump has that Ron DeSantis never will. And it's by Sam Adler-Bell, all right? Hyphenated Sam Adler-Bell, right? And Mr. Adler-Bell is a writer and a co-host of Know Your Enemy. So it's a left-wing podcast about the conservative movement. So let's know our enemy together. And let's grieve for what we've lost, but let's not do anything that restricts our future freedom of movement. So Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida is in a trap of his own devising. His path to the Republican presidential nomination depends on convincing Donald Trump's base that he represents a more committed and a more disciplined version of the former president, that he shares their popular grievances and aims only to execute the Trump agenda with greater force and skill. So populism is a spasm, right? You can't, it's really, really hard to have an ongoing populist movement. In fact, it's virtually impossible. You're not going to develop populist institutions, generally speaking. Populism is a reaction when the people react against a governing elite. And so it's hard to build any institutions. It's hard to build any institutional movement around populism. It's a spasm. It's a temporary phenomenon. It's a rejection of the way the life is being conducted right now. And Donald Trump kind of embodies populism, and he embodies that LOL, nothing matters attitude. But Ron DeSantis' path to the Republican nomination depends upon convincing a GOP elite grown weary of Donald Trump's erratic bombast, not to mention electoral losses and legal jeopardies. So Donald Trump has convincingly lost the 2018 election midterms, the 2020 presidential election, and the 2022 midterm elections, where Republicans were expected to do much, much better than they really did. So he is on a long losing streak. So GOP elites never liked Donald Trump, really, really don't like him now. And Ron DeSantis has largely, convinced the GOP elite that he is the one to back. Ron DeSantis represents himself as a much more responsible alternative, that he is shrewd where Donald Trump is reckless, that he is bookish where Donald Trump is Philistine, that Ron is scrupulous, cunning, and detailed-oriented where Trump is impetuous and easily bored. And I think this is true. So in short, to the base of the Republican Party, Ron DeSantis must be more Trump than Trump. But to the donors and to the Republican elite, he must be much less than Trump. So that's a great way of summarizing it. This comes from a leftist. And I think he's absolutely right. To the Republican base, Ron DeSantis needs to be more Trump than Trump. But to the Republican donor class and to the Republican elites and to the undecided voters, right, he needs to be much less than Trump. So far, Ron DeSantis has had far greater success with Republican elites. He's paired an aggressive stance on culture wars with free market economics and an appeal to his own competence and expertise. So he has corralled key Republican donors. He has corralled Fox News, the Rupert Murdoch media empire executives, conservative thought leaders from National Review to the Claremont Institute. He polls consistently and considerably higher than Donald Trump with wealthy, college-educated, city and suburb-dwelling Republicans. So Donald Trump has lost the last 3 elections in the suburbs. There has been a 2% swing against Donald Trump and what he represents in the suburbs from 2018, 2020, 2022 compared to what Donald Trump was doing in 2016. So it's in the suburbs where Donald Trump is losing, and he's losing consistently 3 times in a row. So for the GOP, the primary fight has begun to tell an all too familiar story. It is the elites versus the rabble. And speaking of rabble, here's Tucker Carlson.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Imagine being a historian 100 years from now trying to figure out what happened here. There are a lot of questions that are going to puzzle you, but one of the most baffling will be, how did Joe Biden get the Democratic nomination in 2020? 2020 was the year, you will remember, when we learned that white people are bad and systemic racism is responsible for everything that has gone wrong in the world. And yet, 2020 was also the year the Democrats nominated, by their free choice, an elderly white man from a slave state who'd once eulogized a Klan recruiter. So the anti-white party picked the white guy. How did that happen? Well, it's pretty simple. Democrats care about power, and power derives from winning. When you lose, you don't have power. And Bernie Sanders couldn't win. Sanders terrified the donor class. So Democrats went with Joe Biden, who loves the donor class and is loved by them. And from a fundraising perspective, that turned out to be a wise choice. By the end of that cycle, Democrats had spent a total of $8.4 billion. That includes $400 million just from Mark Zuckerberg. And that total does not even include the tens of billions in free media coverage, as slick and dishonest as any paid ad, but that, unlike paid ads, is not regulated by campaign finance law. So if you add all of that up, the Democratic Party dropped more in that presidential year than the entire annual GDP of most African countries, all to dislodge Donald Trump from the White House. Nothing like that has ever happened. Can they do it again? That's the question before us, and it's a tougher question this round. 2.5 years ago, many voters could tell themselves that Joe Biden might unite the country. Some mistook his dementia for moderation. But no one can make that mistake now. With the American economy in decline and the rest of the world in obvious chaos, Biden's going to have to come up with a whole new set of lies in order to keep his job, and that's not an easy thing. And that may explain why, as of mid-April 2023, where we are now, Joe Biden still has not formally announced his re-election campaign. He was asked about it this morning on NBC. Here he is, sounding less than all in.
Are you?
Okay, that's pretty moronic analysis. Okay, we gave the rebel a choice there. I've even got Republican friends who say that if Biden runs against Trump again, they're going to vote for Biden. Luke Croft says, we need another 4 years of Joe Biden. We need competent technocratic governance that can save us from the Coomers and the theocrats. The donor class knows what they're doing. Tucker is delusional, says the chat. Okay, let's get back to this high IQ essay in the New York Times, which I really think nails it. All right, it's an essay by a lefty, but it nails it. So Trump appears to have taken notice of this incipient class divide, and he keeps skewering Ron DeSantis as a tool for globalist plutocrats and the Republican old guard. So Trump is very much noticing what is happening, and he is very effectively counterpunching. So Donald Trump has been surging in the polls even before his indictment. In the past few weeks, he has skewered Ron DeSantis as a tool for globalist plutocrats and Republican old guard. Since his indictment by a Manhattan grand jury, Trump has sought to further solidify his status as the indispensable people's champion, attacked on all sides by a conspiracy of liberal elites. So while Republican donors and Republican operatives may prefer a more housebroken populism, it is Donald Trump's surmise that large parts of the base still want the real thing, warts and all. And if his wager pays off, it will be a sign not just of his continued dominance over the Republican Party, but also of something deeper, an ongoing revolt against the best and the brightest, the notion that only certain people with certain talents, credentials, and subject matter expertise are capable of governing. So as each month goes by, more and more of our most important decisions are being taken by elites. And I'm not inherently opposed to that. I am equidistant between technocratic rule, elite rule, and populist rule. So there are plenty of issues where I side with populists, plenty of issues where I side with a technocratic elite. So by and large, with regard to COVID, I side more with the elite and the technocrats than with the populists. When it comes to immigration and the basic recognition that different people have different gifts, I side with the populists over the technocratic elites. So during his second inaugural address in Tallahassee in January, Ron DeSantis embraced the culture war pugilism that has made him a Fox News favorite. He railed against open borders, identity essentialism, the coddling of criminals, and attacking of law enforcement. Florida, he reminded his audience, is where woke goes to die. But the real focus was on results, a word that he keeps repeating. Ron DeSantis promises competent leadership, sanity, and liberty. So I have no doubt that Ron DeSantis would be much more effective at running things. I have no doubt that Ron DeSantis would be much more competent in governing compared to Donald Trump. For most of the speech, Ron DeSantis sounded very much the Reaganite conservative from Central Casting, talking about, low taxes, deregulation. So Ron DeSantis' populism is heavy on cultural grievances, light on economic ones. So these maneuvers tend to endear him to the nationalist crowd. He flew a few dozen Venezuelan migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard. He attempted to ban critical race theory at public colleges. He retaliated against Disney, criticizing his Don't Say Gay bill. So he did all these things to calibrate and burnish his populist bona fides without unduly provoking GOP elites who long for return to relative conservative normalcy. But is there enough of a constituency in America for conservative normalcy? So Republican mega donors like the Koch family, the hedge fund billionaire Ken Griffin, admire Ron DeSantis in spite of his populist firebrand image that he periodically plays on TV. So Ken Griffin told Politico that he hopes that Ron DeSantis will blunt the populism that has turned Republican politicians against the corporate world. And he gave $5 million to Ron DeSantis' re-election campaign. So Ron DeSantis' principal claim to being Donald Trump's legitimate heir is his handling of the COVID pandemic in Florida. And he depicts his decision to reopen the state and to ban mask mandates as a bold move against technocrats and scientists. All right? But his disdain for experts is selective. So while Donald Trump has kind of this knee-jerk reaction against experts, Ron DeSantis simply prefers some experts and elites to others. So when he was deciding how to address the pandemic, Ron DeSantis collaborated with Stanford epidemiologist Jake Bhattacharya, and he followed the recommendations of a group of epidemiologists from Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford, pushed for a swifter reopening. So Ron DeSantis had a preference for their recommendations over those of Anthony Fauci and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So Ron DeSantis does not signify a rejection of expertise as such, only an embrace of alternative expertise. Right? Ron DeSantis wanted to save Florida's tourism economy. He found experts who would tell him how to do that. So Donald Trump is much more populist and much more rejecting of expertise in general. So Ron DeSantis is not really against elites. He just wants to replace the current elites in academia, corporations, and governments with more effective, more conservative elites who have not been infected by the woke virus. So Ron DeSantis doesn't want to do away with the technocratic oligarchy. He wants to repopulate it with people like him. So populists, they have different aspirations from Ron DeSantis. And there's a left-wing historian, Christopher Lasch, who's been quoted a great deal by conservatives in the last 10 years. He wrote back in 1994, "The reign of specialized expertise is the antithesis of democracy." And that's absolutely right. The more you turn government over to the experts, right, the less the people get to rule themselves. So in the 19th century, European visitors to America were impressed and unnerved by finding even farmers and laborers devouring periodicals and participating in the debating societies of early America. So the defining feature of America's democratic experiment was not just the chance to rise in the social scale, but the absence of such a scale that clearly distinguishes commoners from gentlemen. The 20th century capitalism resulted in a maldistribution of intelligence and competence. You had experts usurping governance, and the value of practical experience has plummeted. So Christopher Lasch briefly came into vogue among conservatives during the early years of Trump as president, but they never grasped the central claim that generating equality of competence would require economic redistribution. Well, you are never, ever, 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 ever going to have equality of competence, right? Because different groups have different gifts. Some groups are more competent than others, right? Some people are more, efficient and effective and intelligent and capable than other people. So in his 2011 book, Ron DeSantis railed against this leveling spirit that threatens to take hold in the Republic. Right, his principal target in this book is redistributive justice, like any effort at all to share the benefits of economic growth more equitably. Right, Ron DeSantis doesn't want to use government power to provide more for the poor or to provide more health coverage, higher wages, or jobs. So Ron DeSantis has adopted populist talking points, but he has no more sympathy now than he did 12 years ago for populism. Right? He does not have the ethos of disdain for expertise that Donald Trump has embodied. So Ron DeSantis represents a bulwark against populism, a bulwark against Donald Trump-style disgust with expertise. Right? Ron DeSantis wants to convince Republican voters that their enemies are cultural elites rather than economic ones, that their liberty is imperiled not by the existence of an oligarchy, but the oligarchy's irksome cultural woke mores. So Ron DeSantis has honed an agenda that attacks progressive orthodoxies where they are most likely to affect and to annoy conservative elites, such as gay and trans inclusion in suburban schools, diversity and equity in corporations, black studies in AP classes and universities. Now, none of these issues resonate with the working class, but the conservative elite treat these issues as an article of faith that will motivate the average Republican voter, which is doubtful. So the conservative movement and the conservative elites have staked their viability on the belief that Americans resent liberal elites because they're woke and not because they wield so much power over other people's lives. So they want to replace the progressive elite with a conservative elite with men like Ron DeSantis. And they have the attitude that Americans, by and large, are comfortable. They are free and easy, with the notion that only certain men are fit to rule. Now, Donald Trump, despite what he sometimes represents, is probably no more likely than Ron DeSantis to disrupt the American oligarchy. So as president of the United States, Donald Trump let the plutocrats, run the country. So few politicians on either side appear eager to unleash, as opposed to contain, America's leveling spirit, to contain capitalism, to give every American the means and not merely the right to rule themselves. So we have a culture war, but pretty much everyone is for retaining elite rule. Okay, I'm going to give Tucker Carlson one more chance to say something profound.
You saying that you would be taking part in our upcoming election in 2024?
Well, I'll either be rolling an egg or being the guy who's pushing them out.
Come on, help a brother out. Make some news for me.
I plan on running out, but we're not prepared to announce it yet.
He can barely speak the words. We're not prepared to announce it yet, he says with his eyes closed. Well, why aren't they announcing it? Well, you know why. He's going to be 82 by the next inauguration, and no one really other than his wife thinks that's a good idea, because it's not. So where does that leave Democrats? Well, if you're a rational person who took them at their word, you would assume the Democratic Party, would replace Joe Biden with someone who embodies their highest values. You imagine a trans black woman with a background in corporate HR, or a Latinx drag queen with purple hair and lots of face piercings, or maybe even Kamala Harris. But no, in fact, no chance. That would be principled, and therefore they will never do it. Nominating someone you say you support? No. When Biden leaves, or more likely is shoved aside, they're going to nominate another straight white man who loves the big banks. Someone even oilier and faker than Joe Biden. Why would they do that? Because it worked last time. And we're guessing, if we had to bet tonight, it's going to be Gavin Newsome. We can't say that for certain, but we have noticed Gavin Newsome was at the White House not long ago when Joe Biden wasn't, just kind of measuring the curtains. And then over the weekend we saw this, Gavin Newsome sitting down with the Democratic Party's former spokeswoman, now in residence at MSNBC, Jen Psaki. Psaki didn't conduct really an interview. She's not a journalist. She gave Newsome instead a chance to outline his platform for when he takes complete control. So don't dismiss him. You may be in the habit of dismissing Gavin Newsome. Pay close attention as he gives his pitch on MSNBC.
You know, I just finished 18 events in 5 days in California. I've sacrificed my heart and soul for my state, and I take a backseat to no one on that. So I get it. But I also don't get what's going on in this country. I don't get why everybody's not doing what we're doing. All the progress the last half century is being rolled back in these states in real time. In just the last few years, I don't think people fully understand the rights regression, individual liberties, on civil rights, on voting rights, on the gerrymandering that's happening out here.
Well, I mean, is your brain exploding? If you're a literal person, maybe so. This is the guy who forced every one of his 40 million residents in his state to get an experimental vaccine, whether they wanted to or not, lecturing you about individual rights and civil liberties. Quote, I don't get why everyone isn't doing what we're doing in California.
Okay, that's absolute nonsense. He didn't force everyone in California to get the vaccine. California is only about 70% vaccinated. Now, he was the first governor to shut down a state in reaction to COVID, and I think he was absolutely right to do that. So credit to Gavin Newsom. I think he has been at least an average, if not an above average governor of California.
He says. Maybe because it's not working? Because the people who live in your state who can afford to leave have? More people have left California this year than any state in the country. California, the largest net emigration in the United States. They actually ran out of U-Hauls. It was that bad. So you have a mixture of billionaires and desperately poor people who are dependent upon the state. Kind of like Latin America. That's exactly the economic structure, increasingly, of the state of California. It's not a place of promise, and you know that because middle-class people with families aren't moving there. That's how you know. Is your state doing the right thing? Well, people who haven't made it but would like to would be moving there, not fleeing from tyranny in other countries or desperate poverty in Central America, but from.
Okay, so it is expensive to live in Florida, but it's not like middle-class people are just inherently superior to working-class people or to upper-class people. So generally speaking, over the past 5-8 years, the people who move into California are more affluent, better educated, and higher earners than people who move out of California.
Other parts of America. Are they moving there? No, they're not. Where are they going? Well, actually, they're going to Florida. That's not a political point. It's just true, and it's measurable.
Okay, so there are a lot of housing restrictions in California. All right, there are a lot of environmental regulations. California is a fairly highly regulated state, which makes it difficult to build affordable housing, and that has led many people to leave California, particularly people on the lower half of the economic spectrum, and move to places where it's cheaper to live, such as Texas and Florida. I don't see how that's some devastating critique of California. So all the predictions were that California would have 10 million more residents now than they do have. I don't think California is disadvantaged because we are losing population. I think California is better off for having lost population over the past few years. I think it's a good thing. I am not eager for more affordable housing, right? I just want to leave housing up to the free market. Let housing stay super expensive. I don't want California to grow. I don't want a boom in affordable housing, right? I want California to, as much as possible, stay pristine, and I don't want more people moving in. So I am just fine with more people moving out of California than moving in. I think that makes California better, not worse.
So you'd think if you were a normal person and you were running California, you'd think, what are they doing in Florida that we should be doing? No, not Gavin Newsom. And this is the key to his appeal to Democratic leaders. Like Joe Biden, he will literally say anything, and then he'll take it to 11 and lecture the person who's doing a better job than he is on how he's a bad person. Watch Newsom tell the governor of Florida how to run a state.
There was a pretty startling split screen. You had 1,000 kids in Nashville out there protesting the lack of action on gun reform measures. Well, you had Governor DeSantis signing a bill on permitless carry behind closed doors.
Yeah,
what did you make of that?
Scared to death.
Who is he scared of?
Scared of the people. Scared of the
people
public.
in Florida?
Yeah, that overwhelmingly oppose that position. I think the majority of NRA members, probably oppose that position.
This is what happens when everything about you, from your physical features to your very soul, has been altered by cosmetic surgery. Just like Joe Biden, but younger. You'll say literally anything. Words have no connection to reality. There's no expectation that you're describing something real. You're merely using words as a tool to gain power. That's terrifying. It's dishonest to its core. So you just heard Gavin Newsom say that.
Okay, let's have a look at Tucker Carlson's posture. So it's pretty good, all right? He's got a nice long neck. He's just leaning forward just a little bit, but it's not really distorting his musculature. So let's do an Alexander technique analysis.
That only leaders who are, quote, scared of the people let the people carry firearms. They're so scared.
Okay, it's hard to laugh without compressing yourself, right? So compression isn't bad. It's bad if it's unthought through, if it's habitual, if you're doing it as without even knowing what you're doing. But yeah, if you're going to laugh, you're going to compress in some ways. If you're going to have an orgasm, you're going to compress. So there's a time and a place for muscular tension and compression, but you don't want excess elements of it, generally speaking, as an ongoing habit.
Scared of the people, they let them defend themselves. By contrast, when you're a completely legitimate leader presiding over a system that's not rigged, you start confiscating guns. You live in a state where only the governor's bodyguards can be armed. It's like, what's your...
Also, notice the beautiful symmetry in Tucker Carlson's shoulders. So most people have one shoulder that's much more compressed than the other. So I sleep on my left side, I think, about 90% of the time. So my left shoulder is a little bit more compressed than my right shoulder. But Tucker's got a nice equidistance in his shoulders. Good for you, Tucker.
Seeing here is not just the triumph of packaging over reality, but the triumph of dishonesty over truth. That's so dishonest that he's not even trying to convince you. He's trying to reshape reality itself. By the way, why wouldn't he? If men can become women, then why wouldn't everything Gavin Newsom says be true just because he said it? So what's the effect on the actual state, our largest state, the prettiest state, what was for decades the economic engine of the United States, California? What has been the effect of Gavin Newsom's leadership on that state? Well, this has been well chronicled. Newsom's been the governor of California, beat a recall recently, since 2019 for 4 years. Before that, he ran San Francisco, where he's from. So how's San Francisco doing? Under good leadership, San Francisco would be thriving. But under Gavin Newsom's leadership, well, here's what's happening in San Francisco.
And the question, Tucker's chuckle is a bit gay. I don't think it's a gay chuckle. I think it's a very straight chuckle. Do I wear my CPAP on my side or laying flat, bro? I got bad news. My CPAP kicked the bucket 6 weeks ago. So instead of sleeping with a CPAP, this is what I'm sleeping with these days. So I've got this nice, like, inclined pillow, which I noticed my nasal passages tend to get blocked up at night. So I have to get a bit of elevation and then just one pillow on top of this angled pillow. And I don't think I've had quite the quality of sleep that I had with a CPAP. So I need to go out and buy a new CPAP, but I don't want to go through the doctors. Like, if I go through the doctors and follow the rules, it'll cost me thousands of dollars. I just want to go buy a CPAP on the black market, save myself some money. Or what could possibly go wrong? But sometimes my nasal passages are really blocked up. They tend to block up at night. I need that elevation. I often wake up at night and my mouth is so dry because my mouth's popped open while I'm sleeping, and unfortunately I'm breathing through my mouth. So sometimes when I'm really struggling to open everything up, this is what I do. All right, this is a fair dinkum. All right, look at the elevation on this baby. All right, this isn't messing around. I mean, I'm really elevated, and then the old nasal passages open up, not so comfortable for sleeping. And at times in the past, I'd wake up with back pain with this type of elevated pillow. I haven't suffered from that the last 5 weeks. Baruch Hashem. Your breathing can be fixed by your diet. Really. They call that a mouth breather. I hear dentists don't like that. Well, I've got a mouth guard in there. This mouth guard, mate, it's only supposed to last like 3 months and then replace it. But I've had it for like 6 years and I haven't had to replace it. Now, I got the type of mouth guard that elevates the lower part of my jaw a little bit, and that helps, open up the nasal passages. But there's a downside to that. It's created gaps in my lower teeth because it's brought my lower jaw forward. So this is how I sleep. I got this is all night, and then I sleep like this. The air's coming in like this, and so I'm waking up and my mouth is just dry. But this, if I don't have my mouth guard in, I grind my teeth, and then my teeth just become incredibly sensitive. So, better a mouth guard, better CPAP and a mouth guard. I finally mastered a few months ago. In Australia, I finally mastered wearing a CPAP and a mouth guard at the same time. It used to be that I'd switch in and out and just do one at a time. But I finally mastered being at ease with having my mouth guard in and the CPAP on. And then my bloody CPAP, after 10 years of faithful service, just goes out on me. So now I'm on the hunt for a new CPAP, looking for one very reasonably priced, and don't bother me with that whole prescription thing. What about freedom? Freedom! Why can't people buy their own bloody CPAPs without needing a doctor's prescription? It's a shanda.
Friends identify the victim as Don Carmignani, a former San Francisco fire commissioner. He suffered a fractured skull, broken jaw, and lots of lacerations to his face and head. Carmignani showed up to his mother's place after they refused to move. Soon they picked up and put down near the corner laundromat. Carmignani confronted them, and that, they say, is what provoked the brutal beating. The crime angering and...
don't confront criminals, thugs, people with low impulse control, right? Look for another solution. Usually not a good idea to confront criminals.
Traumatizing those who heard or saw it all unfold.
I mean, grieve for your lost freedoms. Like, grieve for the destruction of your city. Grieve for the destruction of the favorite parts of your city. Grieve for the destruction of your community. Grieve for the destruction of your people. But, grieve and whatever, but please don't do anything that will restrict your future freedom of movement. I think that's the important thing.
I moved here because I love the city, and it's becoming more and more disturbing to live here.
Yeah, they just closed today, actually, a Whole Foods in downtown San Francisco. Not a mom and pop place.
So, to what extent is Gavin Newsome responsible for this? Maybe 5%, 10%? I don't think he's a majority of the problem. I mean, this is an overall problem with the Democratic Party. This is one reason why I'd always vote Republican, because no matter how weak and spineless the Republican, they're invariably better on crime and punishing super predators than Democrats.
Whole Foods, a well-backed, in fact, owned by Amazon company, biggest company in the world, owns the grocery store, and they still had to close it. A grocery store that caters to rich people in one of the richest cities in the world, and they had to close it because why? Because the people who worked there were too afraid for their own physical safety to show up for work. So that's what's happening in San Francisco. And by the way, last week, Bob Lee, the founder of Cash App, was murdered, stabbed to death on the street, and what they tell us is one of the nicest parts of San Francisco. And then apparently, according to surveillance video, the guy who murdered him, randomly, just murdered him on principle, I guess, walked down the street completely at ease, pulling a rolling bag behind him because he has nothing to fear because there are no cops. This is a state in which crime has been legalized, and the only crimes are now thought crimes. If you disagree with the people in charge, then you're in serious trouble. But if you hurt others or steal, you're fine. You're part of a protected class. That's the definition of tyranny. And there are still some people in California who understand that. Here's one sheriff in Riverside County.
In the last 10 years, criminals have become increasingly more violent and brazen. What we are seeing in response to these very lax laws on crime, the push to decriminalize everything, the push to lessen the penalty for something or even take away the penalty for crime, is basically emboldening criminals to do more. It's really horrifying for law enforcement, and it is horrifying for the public that has to deal with it.
So here's our guess. We don't know.
Oh, sorry, bro. I had to call in because I'm the San Francisco correspondent.
Thank you. San Francisco Bureau Chief. I've promoted you to Bureau Chief.
Yes, it's a very august title for a very august position. So I'm going to be very sober here.
I mean, you're very august even during times of peak pleasure.
Yes. But I'm crossing that Rubicon. I can't sleep at night, and I need to cross that Rubicon. I'm looking the part, dude. So, yeah, this Bill Lee thing, Bob Lee, Robert Lee, I think, Bill Lee, I think it was.
Bob Lee, man. What was he doing walking the streets at 2:30 a.m.? Does he play for the other team?
Well, he was in a very nice part of town. But the thing is, the nice parts of town, but right up against the worst parts of town. So it's a very weird sort of geographical situation where you're in a nice part of town, you walk one block, and suddenly you're in Wakanda, as it were. And it's been like a doubly fascinating story for me because it's all over the local news here. Apparently, he was stabbed, but he then sort of like ran into traffic begging for help.
Yeah, and showed off his stab wound, and someone just drove off.
Yeah, people are just like, I'm not dealing with this. This is just too much, because you can't drive in downtown San Francisco without a thick skin. I mean, it's just, you must have one. Otherwise, the scenes you will see, like people will just jump out in the middle of the road when you're driving, and so you just have to assume anybody approaching your car, a moving car, is insane. You have to assume that way. And so you don't stop for strangers who are begging for help, So
no, I understand. I understand why he didn't stop.
Yeah, and like I start to think like, what would I have stopped? Truth be told, 2:30 a.m. downtown San Francisco, some guy's like screaming. No, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop. You know, and I can.
Yeah, because Bob Lee wouldn't stop for death. Death kindly stopped for him.
Yeah, and then that's one layer of the story. The next layer of the story. So you know the Nextdoor app. I don't know if you're part of it. I am.
Yes.
It's sort of like a neighborhood gossip site.
Yeah.
And so people are reading the story and they're just sort of decrying this. Like one woman was like sanctimoniously lecturing the rest of us is like, we need to be better people. We need to stop, as if she would have stopped, right? Which is highly dubious. But that's a weird dynamic where there's this sort of collectivist moralizing that goes on Nextdoor, which I think is the province of women. And this is how women, I mean, Nextdoor is probably 80% women to right off the jump, you know. And there's this sort of virtue signaling, moralizing. It's very interesting.
Yeah, virtue signaling is virtuous. It's good that people signal how good they are. So even though it's often fatuous and empty, you know, it's better that people signal that they are good people rather than signal that they don't give a toss about being a good person.
Yeah. And so, you know, it was food for thought. Like, it made me think about, you know, what a strange circumstance this was, right? So that's layer 2 of the Bob Lee story. So the layer 3, Chuck Johnson, our friend, our mutual friend, your personal acquaintance, not mine.
Yeah, sober-minded analyst.
Yeah. He publishes a piece, and he's such a weird guy, but he says that the victim here was A, involved in some very financially dubious activities, and B, heavily into drugs. You know, like how he would know, I don't know. This is sort of my problem with Chuck Johnson. He just makes these incredibly bold claims, you know, and this is just yet another one that, you know, and he sort of casts aspersions on Bob Lee and thinking that he was out prowling for drugs when he was killed. So I haven't seen a picture of the suspect yet, and I don't know if there is a suspect or an identified suspect, but that was a third dimension to this story. And so, and then I'm hearing, like, I'm talking to casual friends of mine, and they're telling me about their property values going down, and that, you know, they think that this particular killing is going to be the catalyst for some sort of right-wing reaction, which I had to sort of hide my power level and say, oh, do you think? You know, but I'm wondering when is it going to happen? So, and then, in sort of in a moment of inspiration in the middle of the night, I made a post on Nextdoor, which I rarely do, and I just wrote one sentence, and I wrote, "You voted for this mayhem, period," and then posted it. You know,
yeah,
just to see what the waters, you know, just to
yeah,
fill out the waters, and so a lot of people liked it, and then I got a course sort of the you know, textbook kind of leftist response, but things are getting worse here. There's no question about it. It's palpable, it's noticeable, and people are talking about it. So, you know, we may have had this conversation a year ago, and I was a little bit more bullish, more optimistic. But just the amount of crime and the brazenness of this crime and the sort of they're upping the ante on the violence seems to be noticeable.
That was a great post because it was very short. And I hope you didn't like jump in to defend it. You just, you know, just made your point with absolute brevity, and then you didn't allow it to consume your life, I assume.
I just let it go. I just wanted to see where it was going.
Beautiful.
You know?
Yeah.
See who would take it on. So I thought that was interesting. But it's just weird how, you know, San Francisco keeps making the news, you know, and it's just weird living here and finding the city being in such a punching bag And at the same time, like my day-to-day life is just completely fine. You know, it's sort of very discordant. The media paints just such an exaggerated portrait of the way things are, and it's just very, interesting to hear public perception versus reality.
How often?
And how I love reality.
Yeah. How often do you have to wipe human feces off the bottom of your shoes?
Never.
Okay,
but
beautiful.
I know what to avoid.
You know how to avoid it.
I know
you
the
can
places where to avoid, right?
You can spot those piles and you step around them.
Yeah. So, luckily, I'm out in the, kind of the hinterlands of the city. So, I'm not in a cool. It pays not to be a hipster, right? Because all these hipster enclaves with the astronomical rents are usually the places that get hit the hardest by the sort of fecal scourge. So,
what's the most likely explanation for Bob Lee walking the streets at 2:30 a.m.? He was trying to do something good or neutral, or he was engaged in the pursuit of bad behavior. So I would say the odds are probably 5-1 that he was engaged in nefarious behavior.
I think he was probably leaving a party and he was probably high on coke.
Yeah.
If I had to guess.
I mean, there are rarely good reasons to walk the streets at 2:30 a.m. I mean, you just ask your grandma. Like anyone ask your grandma, and they'll tell you that nothing good happens after midnight.
Yeah, that's right. Reminds me of a story. Like, when I was like 19, I was a Vista volunteer. I don't know if you know what those are.
No.
But it's kind of like this. It's kind of like the Peace Corps, but it's for the domestic. It's a very lefty thing. You go into blighted neighborhoods and you're young and idealistic and you help out the Wakandans and so forth. And, I did this for a year, not because I was really that consumed with idealism, but it was actually the only job I could find. So anyway, so I had to work at one of these neighborhood organizations, kind of like the ones that Barack Obama ran, a community organizing organization. Right? And so it was run by this state legislator. And he told a story, which was very amusing so he was once waxing lyrical about his days as a civil rights organizer in Florida. And he was telling the story about how there's like, we used to call them hanging judges in Florida, like these Southern judges that a little bit ham-fisted, shall we say. And so there's this one guy that was arrested in a bad part of Tampa, or it might have been Miami, I forgot which. And it was a bad part of town, right? And I forgot what he was charged with, but the judge said to him, and this is this guy relating the story to him. The judge said to the defendant, "You got arrested in Browntown at 2 a.m, and we both know there's only 2 reasons a white boy is in Browntown, and ain't none of them legal."
Yeah.
Guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I thought was a great story.
Yeah, and it's more true than not.
Yeah, exactly. Things are often what you think they are, right?
Yeah.
People they try to get you off of stereotypes, right? But in fact, stereotypes are actually what's true most of the time.
Yeah, there's a great line in the TV show Yellowstone: "Until they find a cure for human nature, man belongs with his own kind."
Yes.
When you go
anyway,
to
bro,
Browntown,
I got to talk about your CPAP situation.
Okay, but when you go to Browntown,
this.
what are the reasons that you go to Browntown, or have gone to Browntown?
Oh, because I'm just doing the Lord's work, Brooke. I'm preaching. I'm a preacher, and I'm sort of imbued in theology, and I'm just out there saving souls, bro.
Beautiful. Okay, let's talk about my CPAP situation. My CPAP died. I want to get one on the cheap.
Here's you don't need a CPAP. All you have to do is this. cut out carbs. And you can have a little bit of carbs, but just don't have giant servings of carbs. Like, I don't know what you eat, but you got to have a nice salad, and some good healthy food without a big amount of carbs. And that it's that carbs that create the reaction, creates the mucus, which clogs your asthma, your bronchioles. And that's why you get stuffed up and congested.
Okay. Thank
so
you.
Seriously, take a week and just do salads and tell me you don't sleep like a baby. Just 1 week. 1 week.
Have you ever just eaten salads for 1 week? Nothing but salads?
I try, Luke. It's hard. I'm making one right now, actually. But it can be done. Now, I know, but you are vegetarian. So what's a typical dinner for you?
Well, it's Passover right now, so I think I'm going to eat some cheese and a chocolate bar.
Cheese and chocolate, huh? Interesting. Yeah. Chocolate for dinner, huh? Like a dark chocolate or like a...
Had it for lunch as well. It's kosher for Passover. So I like my chocolate like I like my women, like really, really dark.
Yeah, I hear you, bro. Well, wait a second. Chocolate's got a lot of caffeine. Are you eating it late at night?
Oh. Yeah, I don't want caffeine, so...
No, chocolate for lunch, my dude. Chocolate for lunch, and then ixnay on the aquache for dinner, bro.
Yeah, I'll just have some cheese and some yogurt. Some Greek
there you
yogurt,
go.
So it's high in protein.
Throw in a nice salad, man. It's not hard to make a salad. Get some dressings that you like. And I'm telling you, the lettuce, get some good quality lettuce or some arugula, and this will clear out your upper bronchus. That's where all the problems happen.
Is that why you're so clear when you phone into the show? There's like no phlegm or no mucus. You never hear that in your voice because you avoid the carbs.
Well, bro, yeah. And that's what I do because of my problems. I'm acutely, if I'm a master of any subject, Luke, it's upper respiratory affections. Because any subject which I'm intimate and I know all the details of, it's bronchioles. Okay, bro? Okay. I'm just trying to help you. I'm not trying to evangelize. I'm just saying that it's a solution to your problem, and it doesn't involve expensive equipment.
And what are your favorite salad dressings? Do you make your own?
Oh, well, I like 80% of the time I just do a very simple olive oil and balsamic in roughly equal parts, and then maybe some leftover red wine, which I know you don't drink, so and then maybe a couple of cloves of garlic. It's all you need for salad dressing. It's fine. But, I do, just because I love crossing that Rubicon, I do like a Caesar salad as well.
Yeah,
Caesar,
you do.
Caesar's. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right.
And
bro, I got to cook. Huh?
Okay, bro. I was just wondering, what do you do with your need for love and to give love?
I call into the Luke Ford Show, Luke.
Beautiful. This is the place to love and to be loved, bro. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Well said, Elliott Blatt. Okay.
I don't know the guy, but we would bet money that the second that man is vested in his pension, in other words, the second he can leave, he'll be in Idaho or Arizona or anywhere other than that state, because you can't live in a state like that unless you're rich, of course. So if you cared about the state of California, you would do something about this. But Gavin Newsome has completely ignored the condition of his state physically, it's now filthy, or the lives of the people who live there. Instead, he's doing what they all do, which is doubling down on identity politics. Pandering to people on the basis of their skin color or their sexual orientation or whatever. And because ultimately he is a stiff, robotic lizard man, he's doing it in the most awkward possible way. Here he is, April 5th, at the New College of Florida, because he is running for president, trying his best to seem interested as he claps along to an ethnic song and dance. He's got me and you, sister. In his hands, he's got the whole world in.
Okay, so Gavin Newsom's got pretty good use of himself. All right, his head's not tilting too much back on his back, so he's not compressing his spine too much. He's got nice width across his shoulders and across his chest. So yeah, pretty good use of himself, Gavin Newsom.
So, you want to know if he's running for president? Well, he flew to Florida to degrade himself on camera. And self-abasement is the #1 requirement of politics. You have to be willing to leave your dignity at the door. And for Gavin Newsom, that's easy. So, if your first reaction to that...
And if you want to succeed in live streaming, it really helps if you're willing to abase yourself. It really helps if you're willing to be vulnerable, to reveal, very painful, shameful things about yourself. So there are a lot of professions, acting, all right, helps to be willing to abase yourself.
That is to recoil in revulsion and turn off your television set, then you're the threat to democracy. Normal people are the threat to democracy. Newsom's campaign ad, and this is the first of his presidential campaign ads, we predict, makes that perfectly clear. Watch.
We can't solve a problem without first
Look at that. Nice tall neck. A little bit of unnecessary tension in his jaw, but his shoulders are relaxed. Notice how symmetrically they fall off to the side. So some unnecessary tension around his lips, but his forehead is largely free of unnecessary tension.
identifying it. And the problem in our country right now? Authoritarian leaders who are so hell-bent on gaining power and...
So notice how much taller Gavin Newsom's neck is, how much longer and freer it is than Ron DeSantis and the governor of Texas, right? They've got no neck, right? Texas governor, Florida governor have no neck, but Gavin Newsom is leading the way with a nice, long, free neck.
Keeping it by whatever means necessary.
Donald Trump, all right, doesn't have much of a neck. So Trump, DeSantis, that Texas governor are very much stuck in fight or flight. Well, Gavin Newsom is embodying, the free use of the self. I feel like Gavin Newsom has crossed the bridge to total freedom.
That they're directly attacking our freedoms in state after state.
Notice how much longer and freer his neck is than all those Republicans that he showed.
That's why I'm launching the Campaign for Democracy. We're going on the road to take the fight to states where freedom is most under.
So I'm going to wager that Gavin Newsom has had Alexander technique lessons.
Attack, where Republican leaders ban books, criminalize doctors, fire teachers, intimidate librarians, kidnap migrants, target trans kids, stoke racism, condone anti-Semitism, force the victims of rape and incest to carry their attacker's baby, where they ignore the will of the people. They make it harder to...
Right, so when he's saying these charged things, it'd be very easy for him to pull down, constrict his neck, constrict his spine, tighten up, constrict his shoulders and his chest, but he's not doing that. He's got really good use.
To vote and easier to buy assault weapons will help lead the fight to make sure we elect leaders in 2024 who believe in democracy.
Oh, the huevos on that man. You got to give him credit. Everything in that ad is not only untrue, it is the mirror image of the truth. It is the exact opposite of the truth. And it's therefore not just misleading, it is evil. This is not a question of we disagree on something. This is a fact of someone flipping around the truth and inverting it. If you're opposed to men in dresses twerking in front of kids, you're intimidating librarians. If you pause before you say castrate children, you're targeting trans kids. And of course, if you're not with his program, you don't believe in democracy. You're promoting authoritarianism. This is the man who's governor of a state in which there really is no democracy, in which all the candidates and the election outcomes are chosen by the unions, which are in bed with the Democratic Party. It's a one-party state. And the man who presides over a one-party state is lecturing you about democracy? Right. This is the guy who shut down the state of California and all of its schools for all the poor people while he sent his children to in-person private schools and went to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the United States. Meanwhile, anyone who didn't get his creepy shot, he compared to a criminal.
Okay, I don't have a problem with him sending his kids to private school. I don't have a problem with anyone who can afford it sending their kids to private school. I don't have a problem with anyone who can afford an expensive dinner to go have an expensive dinner. Right? These things don't bother me. I don't care.
Drunk driver. Watch.
And with all due respect, you don't have a choice to go out and drink and drive and put everybody else's lives at risk. That's the equivalent of this moment with the deadliness and efficiency of the Delta virus.
Okay, that's dramatic overstatement, very common dramatic overstatement in favor of COVID vaccines. It is a dramatic overstatement which is far removed from reality, but very common, right? Very common for politicians, public figures, to employ dramatic overstatement in the service of what they see as a good cause. So people who said things like what Gavin Newsome just said, they end up with a lot of egg on their face.
So that turned out to be completely untrue, completely provably untrue as a matter of science. And again, the literal among us are driven crazy by watching a videotape like that. But Gavin Newsome is not driven crazy.
And Laponia says, what if you can afford an expensive dinner, but you prevent others from going out to dinner? Well, by and large, America didn't have lockdowns compared to what Europe and Australia had. Like, you went out, you violated lockdown rules in Australia, you got like a $5,000 fine. America didn't have anything akin to that. Right? California didn't have lockdowns, anything equivalent to what Australia had in large parts of Europe. But let's just say that America did. I don't really care if a politician who can afford an expensive dinner goes out and enjoys an expensive dinner, but prevents others from going out to dinner. Right? It's not really a big deal to me. Just like I would prefer a politician who says it's a bad thing to commit adultery, but then goes out and commits adultery, right? You should, set the moral example, or you should, say the right things. And if you're weak in your private life, not a big deal. What if your kids go to private school while you're destroying public education? Not a great thing, but I don't really care if politicians send their kids to private school. And I think Gavin Newsome has destroyed public education. Now, in large parts of California and probably other parts in the United States, public schools, I believe, were effectively closed for 2 years. I think that was a mistake. That was wrong. They deserve to be criticized for it. Maybe up to 3 months, possibly. 3 months, I think you could make a good case for closing public schools from March to June of 2020. Closing them after that, I think, in retrospect, was a mistake, but I can't say that I was out, campaigning at the time that this is outrageous. California had lockdowns, but they weren't lockdowns like Europe and Australia had, where there are massive fines for violating lockdowns. They were more like lockdowns as suggestions. Not the same, bro. Adultery is his business. Being prevented from going out is my business. But there weren't police preventing you from going out, right? America did not have lockdowns that were legally enforced so that you got fined if you left your home, right? In Australia, you got fined if you went too far from home, like more than 5 kilometers or from your workplace.
It doesn't bother him at all. He's never apologized. He's never revised what he said before. He just kept going. This is a man.
So, yeah, Gavin Newsome cucked his campaign manager. I mean, the heart has reasons of its own, guys, that the head will never understand. I mean, I don't endorse cucking your campaign manager, but, I mean, that's what the campaign manager signed up for.
And who will say anything, and people who will say anything tend to be willing to do anything. And like Joe Biden, he has consistently run as a moderate and falsely.
Laponia says there were serious lockdowns in Canada, bro. Curfews at 8 p.m. Yeah, well, Canadians are sheep, man. They're just very obedient of government directives. They're not unruly like Americans.
Back in 2008, as mayor of San Francisco, he promised to eliminate homelessness within the city within 10 years. That, of course, didn't work out. He's never apologized for that. In fact, homelessness has grown by double digits under his stewardship of the state. But if you want to understand who Gavin Newsom really is, if you want to appreciate not just the dishonesty, but the deep malice at the core of him, the desire to hurt other people, and the indifference to human suffering that has been the hallmark of his governorship, watch this clip from 2020 on sobriety.
Clean and sober is one of the biggest damn mistakes this country's ever made.
Look, he's got a nice free neck, a nice long free neck.
I know it's a hold your hand idealistic point of view that somehow magically, I mean, God bless some of you. If you're like me, I've been known to have a glass of wine at night watching some of the nightly news. We all need to self-medicate periodically.
We all need to self-medicate periodically. Well, now we have a country in which virtually everyone is self-medicating all the time, very often with the help of doctors. And nowhere is it worse than in the state of California. If you cared about the people who lived in the state of California, you would notice this. Nearly 30,000 Californians die every single year.
Well, some people are better off self-medicating with a glass of wine or playing video games or other forms of taking a Xanax. Other people are better off being clean and sober. It's not like there's just one definitive rule for everyone.
From drugs and alcohol, that's the most of any state. To put it in perspective, that is close to 10 times as many people who die every year from gunfire. And of course, addiction is the central driver of homelessness, which has not only made the state ugly and dangerous and unlivable, but has also destroyed the lives of the people who are living on the streets. What about them? Gavin Newsom doesn't care. Quote, clean and sober is one of the biggest damn mistakes this country ever made. Really? If you're willing to say that, if you care so little about the people who live in your state that you will mock their sobriety, then you're definitely running for president. But before that happens, we thought we would check in on someone who has spent his life in the state and has seen it change longitudinally over more than 50 years. Adam Carolla is our friend. He joins us tonight to respond to a potential Gavin Newsom presidential run. Adam, he's your governor. What do you think of this?
All right. I could barely watch that without crawling out of my skin or not being clean and sober. Okay, couple things. He came on my podcast 9 years ago, and he told me his number one issue was homelessness. That was his number one issue. I said to him, the homeless population, this is 10 years ago, is comprised of drug addicts and people with mental disabilities and or both. He then said to me, sitting 3 feet across from me, but what about the true face of homelessness, which is a mother of 3 who has a full-time minimum wage job whose husband left her. So that was his idea of solving a problem, and he declared himself the number one issue is homelessness, and that's what he thought homeless was in California. Of course, it's grown exponentially, and no one has ever seen a mother of 3 with a full-time job out on the street. He's a sociopathic buffoon, but the scary part is people vote for him. It's really, you and I, we don't need to solve the riddle of Gavin Newsom. He's a carpetbagger. He's an idiot. He's bought and sold. He's a sociopath. He puts Brill cream on his teeth. Fine. Why do people vote for him? That's the real question that we need to solve.
Well, that's the threat to democracy right there. If you have a population, it's a brand new population, a huge percentage of Californians just got there from other countries. If you have a population that votes for a leader that makes things worse, that is the challenge to democracy, and make things worse measurably, economically, in crime. I mean, that's a huge problem, a scary problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. The great Carroll Shelby, the man who made the Shelby Cobra, left Texas in the 60s to come to California to build cars. Could you imagine leaving Texas and coming to California to manufacture something in 2023? Also, here's a thought experiment that I think would work. Do you think if a number of Joe Biden's aides said to him, you can't run for president, we're already in our second term, do you think he would believe them?
Okay, that's good. Well, I don't run into Biden too often, but if I ever see him, I'm going to say that. The Constitution just won't allow it, sir. I'm sorry. Adam Carolla.
Goodbye.
That is hilarious. Performing in New York.
Okay, so let's switch topics. So, which people are not long for this earth? It is those people who are unwilling to declare that there is an enemy, right, in real life, a realistic enemy who desires to subjugate and destroy their people. And so one thing that I find discouraging about the Japanese is how many are largely unwilling to defend their people because, hey, we have a constitution that was dictated to us by the United States circa 1945. Therefore, we have no choice but to follow the Constitution. So for many Japanese that I encounter, they have the attitude that the Constitution is a death warrant, right? The Taiwanese and the Japanese, right, large portions of their population doesn't seem terribly interested in surviving. They don't seem terribly interested in developing the tools, the techniques, the wherewithal to defend themselves against a rising China. It's kind of pathetic, right? The lack of desire to defend their people that many Taiwanese and the Japanese have. And so I'm listening to this excellent Great Courses series, The Rise of Modern Japan. And this is from Lecture 4, Japan's Civil Society Protests of 1960. But there are so many lessons here for today.
The original security treaty of 1951 was completely unequal. It was imposed on Japan as a condition for ending the U.S. occupation after World War II. It had no expiration date, and it gave Japan almost no say in how or where U.S. troops would be used. U.S. troops could even be used, and I quote, at the express request of the Japanese government to put down large-scale internal riots and disturbances caused through the instigation or intervention by an outside power or powers. For both the Japanese right and the Japanese left, the idea that their own government could request the use of foreign troops against Japanese civilians smelled like a continuation of the occupation. And furthermore, by 1960, that unequal relationship seemed out of step with Japan's post-war economic recovery and broader political rehabilitation. Here are some benchmarks of that recovery. In 1955, Japan joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That's now the World Trade Organization. And that same year, Japan's gross national product surpassed its pre-war peak. In 1956, Japan joined the United Nations. And that same year, Japan surpassed the United Kingdom as the world's leading shipbuilder. So the US-Japan alliance needed a new treaty that would reaffirm US military bases in Japan, but it would also be more respectful of Japan's sovereignty and autonomy. And the United States was willing to renegotiate the treaty because it wanted to showcase Japan as a model ally. Just imagine the contrast. The US and Japan would be joined by a treaty approved by 2 elected assemblies and negotiated by 2 heads of state. Meanwhile, Russia had to send troops into Hungary, its ally, in 1956, demonstrating that it could only keep its allies in line by force. So given that both governments, Japan and the US, wanted a new treaty, why did things get so messy? Here are 4 key reasons. First, the changing battle lines of the Cold War. Now, to be sure, few Japanese wanted to join the communist side of the Cold War. But the idea of navigating a middle course, allowing Japan to remain close to the US, but not in opposition to the Soviet Union and China, that had much wider appeal. The option to remain neutral was especially intriguing because of the rise of the non-aligned movement, a movement of several major Asian nations, including India and Indonesia, who sought to create a group of countries that refused to choose sides in the Cold War. Today, it's hard to recall the optimism surrounding the non-aligned movement, or to recall how thoroughly it alarmed the United States. But at the time, the movement was electrifying. Countries were demanding help from both superpowers, but refusing to ally with either one. In Japan, the non-aligned movement became a way to criticize Japan's alliance with the US. Weren't US bases in Japan a legacy of colonialism? Why was Japan tolerating its subordinate status to the US? Why were India and Egypt free of foreign military bases, but Japan wasn't? And given its incredible post-war recovery, why wasn't Japan leading the non-aligned movement?
Right. So even though it may sound good rhetorically, In the end, it's sanest for a nation state that wants to survive to keep itself under the American nuclear umbrella. Right? Australia was rescued during World War II by the United States. As a result, since World War II, whenever America's gone to war, Australian soldiers have gone to war with America. It's part of the price that you pay for being under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So this significant portion of the Japanese population that would like to remove itself from the protection of the American nuclear umbrella and at the same time not defend itself, right? Just pathological, right? A significant proportion of Japan does not want to survive, does not care about their people, the survival of their people, their culture, their civilization.
A second reason why things got so messy for Kishi was the relatively strong showing by the USSR in the late 1950s. Today, in a post-Soviet world, it's hard to imagine that the Soviet Union once offered a compelling political or economic alternative to the US. But think back to the late 1950s. Which country first put a satellite in space? Well, that would be the USSR in 1957. Which was the first country to send animals into orbit and bring them back safely? That would again be the Soviet Union in 1960. And the Soviet technological challenge had military implications as well. The CIA was flying high-altitude spy missions over the USSR, convinced that Russian anti-aircraft missiles could not reach 70,000 feet. But the CIA was wrong. On May 1st, 1960, the Russians shot down a U-2 spy plane and captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers. That was a huge embarrassment to the US and a propaganda coup for the Soviet Union. It also happened just as Kishi was trying to get the new security treaty with the US approved by the...
Okay, so that's a lot like China, right? There are some ways that China is probably ahead of the United States, and many people who want to despair about the United States can point, oh, here, China is superior to the United States. China is the future. America's the past. America's falling apart. China is rising to the top. And so people were saying the same thing in the 1950s when the Soviet Union had some successes, achieved some firsts ahead of the United States. But overall, the trajectory of the United States is far stronger in the 1950s, even through to today, while China is falling apart.
The Japanese diet. So, for an ordinary Japanese observer, there were real reasons to be leery of renewing a close relationship with the United States against the USSR. A third factor was a rise in tensions around US military bases. Many of those resemble problems with US bases elsewhere in Asia, such as in South Korea and the Philippines.
Right, so there was some individual horrible behavior by Americans, members of the U.S. military that turned Japanese and South Koreans and Germans against having bases. But this is getting distracted by compelling stories of horrible behavior by U.S. Service personnel. Unfortunately, most of this horrible behavior, or a disproportionate amount of this horrible behavior, was by oppressed peoples of color in the U.S. military. But there's a lack of perspective, right? You really want to live without the American nuclear umbrella.
The base. They were arrested, and the case reached Tokyo District Court. In March of 1959, the presiding judge, Date Akio, ruled that the protesters could not be found guilty of trespassing because the U.S. bases themselves were unconstitutional.
Right. So here's a judge saying that protesters in Japan circa 1960 who invaded U.S. bases, they can't be convicted because U.S. bases are not constitutional. So this type of mentality wants a Japan, like the leaders of New Zealand, wants a New Zealand without the American protective nuclear umbrella. This is a people that is not long for this earth if this ever becomes the dominant orientation.
Judge Date insisted that, according to the Japanese constitution, Japan could rely only on the United Nations, not the United States, for its defense.
Imagine how pusillanimous that is. Imagine how misguided that is. To rely on the United Nations for your defense. How many divisions does the United Nations have? Right? On its own, it has none. Right? The United Nations is only effective when it is led by nation states who put their militaries to work in agreed furtherance of this or that United Nations aim. But in and of itself, the United Nations has almost no power, yet a significant portion of the Japanese population, the New Zealand population, and many other populations around the globe want to put their security, right, in the hands of an entity that has almost no power. This is just suicidal.
That ruling was based on strained legal reasoning, and the Japanese Supreme Court overturned it in December 1959. But for almost a year, the constitutionality of US bases in Japan was questioned every day in the news. Date's ruling focused on one.
Okay, so if you're Japan, circa 1960 or even today, if you're a nation state and you want to question the existence of American nuclear protection that comes with the price, right, of having bases on your soil, and this is a focus of your news media, you're not a people long for this world, right? You're not willing to do what it takes to survive, right? You have no awareness of what a dangerous world we live in.
One part of one sentence in Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. I quote, "Land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained."
So many people think that Japan is this shining example of a strong nation state and a people with an indomitable will to survive. Well, the people contains a great deal of weakness.
From there, Date jumped to the preamble, especially the passage, "The Japanese people have determined to preserve our security and existence, trusting in the justice and faith of the peace-loving peoples of the world." Now, Date argued that the words "faith of the peace-loving peoples of the..."
How insane is that? They wanted to trust their survival to the peace-loving orientation of the peoples of the world. There's absolutely no basis to believe that you can trust your people's survival to the peace-loving orientation of the peoples of the world. Just insane self-destructiveness and suicidal tendencies on the part of a significant portion of the Japanese population, the South Korean population, the New Zealand population, the European population. Many of these populations simply lack the will to survive. If this becomes dominant in a people, this is not a people that is long for this earth.
The world meant that Japan's self-defense could only be entrusted to an international police force or some other organ of the United Nations, not the United States. When the Japanese Supreme Court overruled Date, it argued that he had scrambled the context. The prohibition on war material was part of Japan's renunciation of war as a sovereign right of the nation and the
Yeah, if you seriously renounce war as a sovereign right of your nation, rather than just as a rhetorical strategy or a tactical strategy, appropriated to certain situations where you can live freely under the American nuclear umbrella. But if you seriously renounce war as a possibility for your nation, you are not long for this world, because other nations will simply walk all over you, treat you like a bitch.
Threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. So Japan had renounced a right to war, but not a right to self-defense.
Yeah, any people who renounces a right to war is not long for this world. Now, I believe that the primary thing that's going on here in Japan is a canny tactical strategic calculation that they are protected by the American nuclear umbrella, and so they can appear peace-loving, which enables them to grow their economy without spending a lot on their military.
Further, it renounced force as a means of, and I quote, settling international disputes, but not of preventing international disputes. Now, since a completely unarmed Japan would actually invite attack, a self-defense force would prevent disputes. And as a result, a small defense force would be constitutional, but an army would not be. The Supreme Court's ruling established the constitutionality of Japan's self-defense forces and of Japan's reliance on US bases. But despite that legal victory, the protracted litigation created a terrible environment in which to rally support for a new security treaty. The fourth reason things got so messy was Prime Minister Kishi himself. He was a machine politician, rising to power by controlling his party's finances, not by being persuasive or charismatic or loved or respected. He had a terrible relationship with the press, and he had a dreadful political past. Kishi had served in Prime Minister Tojo Hideki's wartime cabinet. He had been in charge of the industrial development of Manchuria, then known as Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state. And in Manchukuo, he had used forced labor to promote rapid industrialization. Under the US occupation, Kishi was briefly arrested as a war criminal. But the US decided...
You know what type of people use forced labor? Those who have the strength, right, the force to compel labor, right? Those who can compel, right? The strong take what they want, the weak endure what they must. That's the way the world works. That's the way the world has always worked, right? I'm coming back here 1,000 times if I have to drill that point home. That's the way the world works. I win, they lose.
That he could be a valuable ally, largely because he was a fiercely anti-communist bureaucrat and he had experience promoting economic growth. Kishi's wartime record made him a juicy target for the Japanese left. He also rekindled public fears of war because he was an advocate of revising the Japanese constitution to eliminate Article 9, the renunciation of war. So the opposition could ask, do you really trust Kishi with national security? Remember Kishi's last great alliance, that alliance with Nazi Germany against the United States? How did that work out? So now we're going to try an alliance with the US against the USSR.
So an alliance with Nazi Germany didn't work out, therefore we're not going to try future alliances? That's just silly thinking, all right? If an alliance with Nazi Germany doesn't work out, you don't take the lesson from it. I'm not going to rely on alliances anymore. You want to choose appropriate alliances that will further your national interests, not alliances that would detract from your national interests.
The very fact that the treaty was Kishi's treaty gave the opposition a huge cudgel. And Kishi obliged the opposition by acting like an autocrat. In 1958, he tried to pass a new law to give police wide powers to carry out preventative detention. Police would be able to take suspicious individuals into custody before they committed a crime, and to conduct searches if they suspected a crime was going to happen.
Wouldn't it be amazing if nature just color-coded people in addition to animals, so you could just tell at a glance, how likely someone was to be dangerous? Now, I'm sure there are some societies where this kind of police power would result in a better society. Right? El Salvador has smashed its gang problem and smashed its crime problem. Now, the Japanese, by and large, don't tend to be a terribly criminally violent people, so this might have been a tad excessive back in 1958.
Police could also prevent demonstrations and parades. That bill reeked of wartime political oppression. Kishi later admitted that he wanted to use the bill to have the power to break the Japanese labor union movement.
Elliott Blatt says the CPAP is low IQ. Bro, the CPAP is the gold standard for treating moderate to severe sleep apnea, right? For many people with moderate to severe sleep apnea, CPAP will be far more effective than eating salads. Now, yeah, people will be better off if they can lose weight, but many people are overweight, right? They don't have the wherewithal to lose the weight, so they're better off using a CPAP. So how's your weight these days, Elliott Blatt?
Particularly the teachers' union. The bill was so odious that Kishi's own party abandoned him and killed the legislation.
Well, I don't think that legislation was odious, right? How many thousands of lives would have been saved with this kind of legislation? So there are advantages to this kind of legislation. There are disadvantages to this kind of legislation. As with almost all legislation, there are advantages and disadvantages. I don't really see the great intelligence benefit of describing legislation as odious or unaesthetic.
Now, the irony is that Kishi controlled large majorities in both the upper and lower houses. So all Kishi needed to do was to use slow and deliberate parliamentary procedures to get the treaty approved. But that wasn't his style. Instead, the harder Kishi pushed, the more he ignored dissent, the more he further enhanced the opposition's argument that he was...
Right, you want to be effective. So sometimes pushing hard and fast is effective. Other times, going slow, being gentle, responding to your partner, right? Putting your focus on your partner's pleasure. That's much more effective, right? You don't want to just go stampeding after the clitoris. What's wrong with a good kiss on the lips?
He was a man of Japan's ugly fascist past and not a man of its democratic future.
Japan's ugly fascist past, I mean, that's what we say about people who lose, right? If Japan had won, we wouldn't be talking about Japan's ugly fascist past.
Kishi's contempt for parliamentary democracy became apparent when he presented the new security treaty to the Diet in February 1960.
So is there ever a reason to have contempt for parliamentary democracy? Yeah, right. There are flaws in parliamentary democracy.
By then, he had successfully renegotiated several key points. Most importantly, he got an explicit commitment that the U.S. would consult Japan on the deployment of U.S. forces. So Kishi and his cabinet went into the Diet confident that they had a great treaty. Too confident. When legislators...
So yeah, this is another evergreen lesson. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to be confident in your own morality and righteousness. You have to be cognizant of how what you're proposing or what you're saying or what you're doing comes across to other people. And so even if you're right, you can be absolutely dead right. Don't be dead right. Right? Take into account how what you're standing for, what you're doing, what you're saying affects other people. Because if the dominant reaction to what you're doing is blistering levels of opposition, that's likely to render you ineffective, and in a battle with reality, reality is always going to win, even if you're dead right.
Asked him whether U.S. bombers could leave their bases in Japan and drop nuclear weapons on, let's say, North Korea. Kishi said no. Such an act would be subject to consultation. But that was a very optimistic interpretation of the actual treaty, which reads, and I quote, "The parties will consult together from time to time regarding the implementation."
Yeah, if you want the safety of living under the American nuclear umbrella, you'll have to give up some freedom, right? You want safety, you want security, you're usually going to have to give up freedom. True for the individual, true for nation states.
Of this treaty, and at the request of either party, whenever the security of Japan or international peace and security in the Far East is threatened. So the opposition pressed Kishi. What if Japan and the U.S. consult on bombing Pyongyang, and Japan says, please don't do that, but the U.S. says, thank you for your opinion. Consultation is complete, we're nuking Pyongyang. To this, Kishi responded, no, Japan has a veto power. To which the opposition said, really, where is that veto power in the treaty? And Kishi and his cabinet had to scramble to explain that somehow implicit in the phrase consultation was an actual veto power for Japan.
Right, so it's not enough to be right. You also have to be able to articulate why you're right, and you have to be able to win rhetorical arguments and the public relations battle if you're going to be effective in politics.
To which the opposition replied, well, if it's implicit, go back and get a treaty with an explicit veto. So all of those factors, the appeal of neutrality and the non-aligned movement, Soviet supremacy in the space race, problems with the bases, and Kishi's own past, all of those factors began to move Japanese opinion away from the treaty. And the opposition prolonged the debate into May 1960 when the U-2 incident occurred. And that allowed the opposition to press Kishi on whether there were any U-2 spy missions based in Japan. So across the country, rallies and petitions against the...
So sometimes when you're consistently on the losing end, when you don't have the power, when the opposition controls all the major institutions, if you can just delay and deny, right, opposing legislation, that's a victory in and of itself.
The treaty were growing larger and larger, with millions of signatures on petitions arriving at the Diet. And ultimately, Kishi boxed himself in. With Eisenhower scheduled to visit Japan, the U.S. State Department kept asking if things were okay, and Kishi responded that everything was fine. But on May 19th, he called for a vote to extend the Diet's time in session. That extra time would be used to vote on the treaty itself. The opposition didn't have the votes to block the extension, but they thought public opinion was shifting their way. So opponents of the treaty sat down in front of the Diet Speaker's office so that he couldn't leave and reach the rostrum.
So often your opponents, particularly in politics, but in life, will engage in illegal and unethical behavior. So does that mean you are then justified in, reacting in illegal or, unnecessarily forceful ways? Just because someone does something ill to you, just because someone engages in illegal behavior, doesn't mean that you're going to be more effective if you escalate your response. And this Japanese prime minister escalated his response, but it wasn't effective. So the most important thing is asking in things like this, is my response going to be effective? How is it going to come across to people who aren't aligned one way or another? So I have full sympathy for what this prime minister does in reaction to the illegal behavior of the opposition. Right? I think he was right, but it didn't work out. Right? His policy turned out to be dead right, and it turned out to be the end of his political career.
Through nonviolent but non-parliamentary tactics, they blocked the vote until 11 p.m. at which point the speaker, a Kishi ally, called in the police and had the entire opposition carried out.
Right, so this reminds me of what the Republican legislature is doing in Tennessee. Right, they responded to two Democratic legislators who interrupted the smooth functioning of the Tennessee legislature by ejecting them from the chamber. That seems to me morally right, legally right, but the repercussions, the implications, the way that the public interprets this may very well turn out to be a negative result for Republicans. So I think Republicans and their reaction in Tennessee are absolutely right, but it could very well be that it's not going to play out in their favor. So it's not enough to be right. You have to be effective.
With the opposition gone, the speaker called the Diet to order and held a vote to extend the Diet session. With the session extended, a vote was called on the treaty itself. It was approved. Kishi had won. And now, unless the upper house voted against the treaty, it would be automatically ratified. It was a classic Pyrrhic victory. Kishi had won the battle, but he had lost the war. Why? The optics of what happened in the Diet were horrific. The opposition had been trying to paint Kishi as an unrepentant warmonger, and he gave them the perfect images. Police physically dragging the...
Right, so even if the opposition is wrong, even if their accusations are unfair, if they're going to be able to effectively mobilize against you, you don't want to give them a sword. Right? Don't give people a sword. I'm embarrassed, but there are times where people have confided in me, and then when I got annoyed with those people, I used what they said against them. I threw it back in their faces. I'm embarrassed that I did this, but it's a very common human tendency. So don't give people a sword. Be strategic. Don't just ask, is this right? Ask what would be the implications. How will this come across to people who don't have a partisan view?
Opposition out of the Diet. Every major newspaper condemned Kishi for acting like an autocrat. Even the Nikkei, the Japanese equivalent of the Wall Street Journal. Japan's leading intellectual, Maruyama Masao, gave a hugely influential speech declaring that the question was no longer the treaty itself, but the survival of Japan as a democracy. He argued, and I quote, "If you have a fragment of reason and conscience, you now have no choice but to join with us and rise up to erase this stain from Japan's political history."
So it's very hard to get anything done politically if all the media are opposed to you, or if all the Jews are opposed to you, or if all the elites, or if all the leading institutions are opposed to you. It verges on the impossible to get anything done, even if you are 100% correct.
By this point, Kishi was politically dead. He didn't know it yet, but he was finished.
Right. So you may not even know it, but you can be finished. So Paul Nealon takes credit for the end of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's the trade partnership between the United States and various Pacific nations aligned against China. This is Mickey Cowles talking with Robert Wright a couple of weeks ago.
They have a dull kind of sentience. I mean, they process information. They organic information. So
who knew? Did you know that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has signed up a huge number of people, including now Great Britain. I think they're 12% of global trade. They will soon be at 20%. They're going to be huge, bigger than the EU.
Well, you think the Cold War would renew America's interest in that?
Well, it might.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's already renewed the Biden administration. They weren't opposed to it to begin with, I believe.
No, for political reasons, it became a hot potato. Thanks partly to Bernie Sanders, I guess.
Well, I know that the anti-trade people on my side of the fence, when we ran somebody, a guy who sort of went a little crazy against Paul Ryan in the primary, Ryan was panicked enough about his anti-trade message that he sort of withdrew support from TPP. Anyway, so this guy, Paul Nealon, who was running against him, his big boast was, I killed TPP, which he in fact did. But, you talk to other people who say, oh, if you're against China, TPP was the way to go because it was designed to exclude China. I don't know who's right in that, but, China hawks are ready to endorse TPP, aren't they? It's designed as an anti-China mechanism.
Right. So never go Paul Nealon, never go full Paul Little, never go full Kishi Mishi, and take care. Bye-bye.